What's going on, guys? Tower number 9 here, and today we're going to talk about how to be more consistent in Star Wars Unlimited TCG. So yeah, let's get right to it here. Um, Picture this. It's turn one of an important game. You're playing double red Sabine. Your opening hand isn't very good. You mulligan. Here's your new hand, and once again, you have no starting units. You have a bunch of stuff that costs 3 or 4 in an event that you can't really play. This is really not where you want to be. Sitting there with no opening card is pretty tough. I have one with no starting unit, but it's a tough scenario. So how do you avoid a situation like this? I have some principles here that might help. They're going to range from deck building strategies to even gameplay tips that can help you be more consistent in the first turn of Star Wars Unlimited and beyond. Let's get right to it. So, first up, deck building rules of thumb here. So, opening units. In general, most decks play something like 9 to 12 starting units and mulligan for them. This gives you approximately a 92 to 97% chance to have an opening play. If you're wondering how I got that, don't worry about it. I will explain that later. However, keep in mind that not all starting units are created equal. So, units like the Spec Force Soldier here can start, but they're notably worse. And one cost units are often weak unless paired with another one cost unit. So when we're saying 9 to 12 starting units, I think ideally you're really talking about units like Sabine Wren here that are units that you will actually want to have as your opening play. And your mulligan strategy can influence this plan as well. So if you're trying to do arena dodging, which is a tactic where when you're going second, you will try to keep more than one starting unit, one in space and one in ground, and then go to wherever your opponent isn't. If you're using that tactic, you might want to have more than just 12 starting units, because if you're mulliganing to do that, that will mean that you have a higher chance to mulligan into not having a starting unit just because you aren't just keeping any hand that has something to start with. So that can be influential. There's a concept called the 12-12-12 rule, I believe, which I think it originates with the garbage rulers, but I could be wrong. And the idea is that as a basic rule of thumb for deck building, you should have 12 opening units, you should have 12 space units, and you should have 12 non-unit cards, just as a general rule of thumb. And I'm not saying, oh, this is exactly what you must do in all your decks. I've played decks that have more in some areas than this, or less in some areas than this. But it's an interesting thing to consider, just as a basic concept to improve consistency. Next up, in order to make your deck more consistent throughout the game, it helps to play the minimum number of cards that you can. This means 30 card decks in Limited, so that's sealed and draft, and 50 card decks in Premier. Well, why should you do this? The answer is that some of your cards are better than others. If I really want to see Fett's Fire Spray pursuing the bounty here, the best I can do is have 3 out of my 50 cards in deck be this card. If I have a 60 card deck, I can still only play 3 Fett's Fire Sprays, and doing that reduces the chance of drawing this key card. Now, one potential exception is sometimes people will play more than 50 cards in order to better resist fatigue. I don't personally recommend this. Fatigue, by the way, is when you run out of cards and start taking damage to your base. It's a term from, I think, Hearthstone or something. But I generally don't recommend doing this as an anti-fatigue tactic relative to playing things like Restock, but I'll also say that if you're planning to do this, you can also do it via sideboarding. In general, I try to keep to the minimum number of cards in main deck. In Limited, there may be more reason to play more simply because Limited decks are more likely to go to fatigue. That being said, in Limited, there's also likely a bigger variation between your worst card and your best card, which makes it still quite important to keep the odds of drawing your best cards as good as they can be by playing the minimum number of cards. Another deck building rule of thumb here is that you should be drawing some test hands. So once you build a deck, you can draw some test hands and see how it looks. You can use this as practicing for resourcing and mulligans as well. If you want to do that to practice resourcing and mulligans, you should have an opposing deck in mind. So let's say that I'm playing Sabine Yellow. I might think, okay, how would I resource or mulligan this if I'm in an aggro mirror? And would it be different if I were going first or going second? So have some scenario in mind when you're doing this, and then you get a little extra practice. But this can quite inform your feel of what your deck has to offer. And you can do this either in person by actually shuffling your cards and drawing new hands, or you can do it with some deck builders. I don't know all the deck builders that are available. I personally tend to use SwooDB, and I'll show you how to do this with SwooDB right here. So here we have SwooDB, and we're going to go to one of my decks here. And This is a Cunning Sabine build that I've been using recently. I actually just played this at a store showdown, and so I have the deck list right here. And I can go this section here where it says draw cards. This is from the view interface. So if you're in the edit interface, what you want to do is hit draw here and it will show you this. If you're in the view interface, you can just scroll down and it will show you the draw cards. So I can draw 6. This is an opening hand. So if I'm thinking, this is an aggro mirror and I'm going first, this seems like a pretty good starting hand. So I can start with Sabine or maybe with Lothal Insurgent if I'm worried about Sabine being ambushed. You can hit this mulligan just to draw a new hand and see what you think. So again, if I'm going first, an A-wing start seems pretty reasonable here. Again, and I can just keep doing this. I can also do more complicated things. Like let's say, okay, so here's this hand. I can think of, okay, let's say I'm going to play the X-Wing, and then I can either do Fleet Lieutenant or Falcon to follow up. I'll resource the extra copies of these. And let's say I want to see what would happen on the next turn. I can hit draw 2, get more cards, think about my next resource, think about what I would do from there, and so on. So this is a really easy way to do it right here in SWODB. But some people might like doing this with the actual cards, getting some shuffling practice in as well, and so on. So that is the sort of the SWODB way to draw test hands. Now let's talk some resourcing tactics. So we're going to change gears a little here and start talking some things that will help your consistency in gameplay, not just deck building. So the resource system in Star Wars Unlimited is really good and interesting, and it allows a lot of flexibility because any card can be a resource. It's not like a game like Magic the Gathering where you have dedicated cards that provide your resources. Anything can be a resource, and that gives you a lot of flexibility in your gameplay as well as in deck building. However, it can also be an opportunity to actually really mess up and make some critical mistakes. I've personally had games where I'm like, oh man, I lost this because I resourced the wrong card. And knowing what to resource and what not to resource can be a way to improve your consistency as well. So as a rule of thumb, it is generally a good idea to resource expensive stuff early and cheap stuff late. So if I draw my opening hand and I see like home 1 in my opening hand, and I'm not going to be able to play that for many turns, and by the time that I would be able to play it, maybe I've drawn another card of that type. Well, in that case, I think it might be advantageous for me to resource that early on. Similarly, late in the game, if you draw like a cheap opening unit, that can be a good thing to resource in order to preserve your more expensive, more valuable cards when you have more resources available to play for them, to pay for them. That said, your resource strategy shouldn't always be the exact same. Cards that might be great in some matchups can be bad in others. If you're playing against Sabine Wren, explosives artist, that Devastator might not help. Sorry, Sabine Wren, galvanized revolutionary rather. So like Devastator here is a 10 cost 10/10, so that is it's a really powerful space unit in like very extended end games, but against Sabine, you're probably not going to get there. And if you get to 10 resources against Sabine, you probably are going to win anyway. So, that might not be the best card there. And if you have that, you should, quite consider resourcing it early and maybe sideboarding it out afterwards. It can also be worth considering how many copies you play of a card when you're deciding whether or not to resource it. So as an example of that, let's say that I have 3 copies of Home 1 and I see one in my opening hand. That could be a great opportunity to say, hey, I'm going to resource this expensive thing early and I'll have access to it late. However, if I know that Home 1 is totally crucial to my game plan, I might hold on to it. And if I only had 1 or 2 copies, I might think, ooh, man, I really want to have this in the late game. I don't know if I'm going to get another one. Maybe I don't want to resource it. So those are some considerations to take into account when you're doing resourcing, and I think they will help you play more consistently on that front. Another nice little rule of thumb is to just know your matchups. So different matchups can require very different game plans. We touched on this a little bit with respect to your resource choices maybe being different in different games. But you don't really want to rely on the same tactics against all your opponents. You can adapt. Even if you're an aggro deck, I've played a lot of aggro games. I've played a lot of Sabine games with different Sabine decks against different opponents. And even then, when my game plan is usually still going to be the aggro, what I resource and what I keep and so on can vary a lot. Like Wing Leader, for instance, is really good in some matchups, and in other matchups, it's really dangerous. And by understanding those matchups, you can improve your sideboarding and resourcing decisions. called become more consistent at having the right answers for a specific matchup, and just generally put yourself in a better situation. So it can help to know what cards are important. So for instance, in an aggro mirror, Fleet Lieutenant is really good because you can play it, attack with another unit, and use that to potentially gain initiative. It's also good to know what cards you can't rely on in certain matchups. So I was talking earlier about how Wing Leader can be a liability in some cases. If you're playing against an opponent, if you're playing against double yellow Boba, you really don't want to be playing using Wing Leader on one of your early units. There's just such a high chance it will end up getting bounced one way or another, and you'll lose that value from the Wing Leader. So in that matchup, maybe the Wing Leader is going to be a card that you resource your sideboard. So these are important things to consider in some cases, and a lot of this knowledge can kind of come with experience and just playing more games with your deck and getting a better sense of how different things want to work. If two people are playing against each other and neither of them really knows what the opponent is doing, the decks can sort of just kind of crash into each other, and it's more luck based, what strategy will end up coming out on top. But if you're going into that matchup and you have a good sense of, okay, this is what my opponent's trying to do, this is what I'm trying to do, this is like what role I should be taking in the matchup, this is what sort of things I want to avoid, this is what cards I especially want to counter my opponent, that becomes very different. So like, if I'm playing yellow Sabine into Han green, for instance, I think one thing that I would really like to have is an exhaust card like Bamboozle or Leia Organa Defiant Princess to try to exhaust Han so that he can't do the 5-6-7 combo by ramping up his resources twice in one turn. So in those matchups, I want to, try and have one of those waiting in hand and ready to play to potentially counter my opponent's powerful move. And by doing stuff like that, you'll increase your consistency by just having a scenario in mind and planning for it and being able to counter when your opponent is in position. Okay, so one last kind of gameplay or kind of out of game tip is the importance of so-called bio. Bio is short for biology. And it may seem ridiculous, but a few things that can be really important in a tournament are sleep, sleep, just food, hygiene, those sorts of things. It might sound silly, but these can really benefit you. So if you go into a tournament and you didn't really sleep last night and you're really hungry and you didn't take a shower and you feel sort of dirty and stuff, this is not where you want to be. Those things are going to be distracting you. Those things are going to be depleting your attention. They're going to make you less focused on the game, and you're going to make more just silly mistakes. So get good sleep before the event. You might want to get something to eat before the event. You might want to make sure you're not dehydrated. It can be good to get a water bottle. A lot of stores will just sell water. I was at a store showdown recently, and I noticed I was getting really thirsty and went and bought a little can of sparkling water or whatever from the store. You might want to have some snacks with you. I know some people take like protein bars and stuff to tournaments. You want to use the restroom during breaks when possible if you have to. You're probably more likely to mess up if you're tired, you're really hungry, you're thinking about what you're going to eat, those sorts of things instead of thinking of the game. And one other note is that your deck's speed can influence this a bit. And that might sound really weird, but if you're playing aggro, the games tend to go quicker and you tend to get longer breaks between rounds. So in that break, you can potentially use the bathroom, get some food, just sort of relax a bit and, de-stress or whatever it is, walk around and see what other people are playing. And if you're playing a control deck where the games go really long, you're much less likely to get a valuable break like that. So that's just a little extra thing to consider. And I think it is an argument in favor of playing a more aggressive, faster paced deck, at least for some of the longer events. So, just something to consider there. And then last but not least here, I do actually have one very special tip, the hypergeometric calculator. And I know that sounds crazy. It is nowhere near as complicated as it sounds. It's not even close to as complicated as it sounds. So this is a tool that can be used to determine odds of drawing specific cards from a deck. You can use this to calculate precise starting hand odds. You can use this to calculate for a cause hit percentages. You can use this to calculate some odds of seeing a card by turn X. I have a URL here, which will also be in the video description below, of a site that has a nice hypergeometric calculator, and I'll show you how to use it right here in the video. Don't be intimidated. This is a very helpful deck building tool. I think it's really solid. So please bear with me while we explain the hypergeometric calculator. So this is the StatTrak hypergeometric calculator site. So then here's how this thing works. you have these values. So population size is the total number of cards in your deck most of the time. And if you're trying to calculate something for like a specific turn, it might be smaller, but we'll start with just some opening hand odds. So let's say that we listened to my earlier tip and made a 50 card deck. And let's say that we listen to the 12-12-12 rule and we have 12 successes in the population. So 12 good starting units in a 50 card deck. And then we're going to see what the odds are of drawing our opening hand. And let's say we want to have at least one success. So this one is the overall number of cards that are in the population. This is the number of cards that are successes. This is the number of cards we're going to see. And this is the number of successes we need. So in this case, let's say we just want to have one card. So I can hit calculate and it will show me the probability that I will have exactly one card, in this case, about 38%. The probability that I will have less than one card and not have an opening play. So in this case, something like 17.4-ish. And here's the odds that I will have more than one card. These are all, for all of these, we're talking about opening plays. So 1 or 2 drops or whatever. The odds that I will have more than one card, we have about a 40, 45-ish. And greater than or equal to 1, which is 1 or more cards, we're going to be at about 83%. So now you might say, hey, Tower, didn't you say that the odds were more like 97%? Well, that's because this is the odds without a mulligan. So in order to calculate the odds of missing, if you mulligan for something, what you want to do is have the failure chance here. So this is the probability that you get less than what you want. And if you assume that you're going to mulligan for this, you need to take this and multiply it by itself. And the reason for that is to actually fail, you have to fail the first time and the second time. So this probability, this 17.4-ish% ends up actually being squared, and thereby the odds of missing are reduced. And similarly, you can do some other calculations. So, you can change these. Let's say I'm running a deck with 15 starting cards. What are my odds of having at least one in my opening hand? Almost 90% here. Let's say I have a deck with only 6. Now I'm looking at only about a 56% chance or so of having at least one opening play. And you can do calculations like that. You can calculate for a cause odds. So let's say I'm calculating 1 for a cause. So the thing that I'm going to show you here isn't the precise way to do it, but the precise way to do it's really complicated. This is the short way to do it. So the short way to do it is you change the population size to 49, because the for cause that you just had in your hand doesn't count. Because that's the card that you're playing. And yes, you're never going to only have one card and be playing it like that, but this is just rule of thumb. Then the number of successes is going to be your number of heroism cards. So let's say that I have a deck with 45 heroism cards, one of which is the for a cause. So we're going to say there's 44 successes left in the population. The sample size is 4. And let's see what my odds are of getting three successes or more. So in this case, we can see that my odds of getting 3 or more cards on a for cause are above 95%, which is pretty good. And we also see that my chance of getting over 3, which is a full 4 damage, is actually only about 64%, which might be less than you think. So one of the things that I learned from playing around with this hypergeometric calculator is that to get for a cause to go off very consistently, you have to have a lot fewer non-heroic thoughts that you might think if you're aiming for the full 4 damage. If you think that 3 or 4 is acceptable, then something like this should be fine. But yeah, similarly, what are my odds? Let's say I'm playing draft and I only have it's going to say it's invalid, but I'm going to change that and fix it. Let's say I'm playing draft and only half my deck is heroism. What are my for cause odds looking like? If only half my deck is heroism in this draft deck, we'd switch it to 30 card total and 14 because the 1 for a cause isn't included. And now we're looking at pretty grim odds. The chances of getting greater than or equal to 3 damage is all the way down to 27%. And that's why for cause isn't a great card in limited unless you can get a lot of heroism in your pool. Okay. So those are just some examples of how to use the hypergeometric calculator. There are a lot of other things you can do. For instance, let's say I wanted to know what my odds are of drawing a 3-drop in a deck that has 15 3-drops. If I've already seen my opening hand and it didn't have one. So in this case, we're going to say the population size is 44. So these are the 44 cards remaining after the 6-card opening. There are 15 3-drops. I didn't have one, and my sample size is only 2 because I'm trying to see. I am trying to see what my odds are of drawing one going into the second turn. And the number of successes is 1. So looking at this, I have a bit better than a 50% chance, but it's not so good a chance that I would really want to rely on that. And you can use these sorts of calculations to inform your understanding of what the odds are of different things. In principle, you can calculate very detailed scenarios for this. It's often not worth the time to do that, in my opinion, but it can still be a very useful tool for doing some basic calculations and getting a better understanding of your build. Okay, so that's the hypergeometric calculator. And now let's sum it all up. So 3 deck building rules of thumb. Consider the 12-12-12 rule as a basic concept. 12 ground unit, 12 opening plays, 12 space units, 12 non-unit cards. In some decks you might want to run more, in some decks you might want to run less, but that's a basic idea of where you might want to be aiming, or at least around there when you're building a deck. You should play the minimum number of cards that you can to give you better chances of getting your best cards, and you should draw test hands to see how your deck is working before going and playing with it. Then 3 gameplay rules of thumb. First up, be careful what you resource. Second, know what cards you need in a matchup, know your matchup and what the important things are. And third, get good sleep, food, and so on for an event so that you're not being distracted and thrown off your game by biological factors. And then last but not least, of course, we do have the hypergeometric calculator, which I just explained, and there will be a link to the StatDirect calculator in the video description below. I'm hoping these tips are going to be helpful for you guys making more consistent decks and playing the game more consistently in Star Wars Unlimited. Feel free to let me know if you disagree with any of these tips, if you agree with any of the tips, if you think there are important factors that I'm missing. If you happen to know who originally came up with the 12-12-12 rule, point it out in the comments and I'll pin it, because we want to give that person their credit. I believe it was one of the garbage rollers, but I could be wrong. And yeah, that's going to about do it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. If you liked this, feel free to like the video. If you disliked it, feel free to dislike the video. I do find that sort of feedback to be helpful. If you want to see more videos like this, feel free to subscribe to the channel. And yeah, that's going to about do it for this one, guys. Thanks again for watching, and we'll be back later with some more Star Wars Unlimited content. I will catch you guys later.